Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for tuning in to hear us hold this conversation about the differences between full decriminalisation and partial decriminalisation of the global sex trade. And we have four very important voices here today, and I'm really glad to be able to welcome Fiona Broadfoot, Mickey Meji, Cherie Jimenez, and Audrey Morrissey. And we're going to cover a lot of important ground today. Across three different continents, confronting the idea of a global model that's been pushed ever more forcefully in recent years. And there's a lot of different elements of this that we need to discuss. One of them being, and I think we really need to begin with this, which is the definitions. Because very often what we confront is people, and I personally think this is the biggest problem that we have on this issue is confronting people who are well-intentioned. The majority of the people that we have these discussions with and these disagreements with are well-intentioned people, and they're not trying to do harm here. They're actually trying to do quite the opposite, but they do not have the depth of understanding about these models and what they mean and how they play out on the ground. So I'm going to start with the difference between a full decriminalisation model. And it's really simple when you get your head around it. Full decrim basically means the decriminalisation of all parties involved in the business of prostitution. So that covers your men, women, trans people, adults, adolescents, everybody who's actually exploited within the system of prostitution. They're all decriminalised. That's fine by us. That's exactly what we're pressing for ourselves. But alongside of that, under the full decriminalisation model, you also have the decriminalisation of pimps, of brothel keepers, of punters or johns as they're known in the United States. All forms of third-party exploitation, whether it's sexual or profiteering. So everybody you can think of, everybody I've mentioned, and some that I haven't, would be decriminalised underneath the full decriminalisation model. So that's something that we need to get really clear. When people talk about decriminalisation, you need to ask them, are you talking about full or partial? Decriminalising who? That's the first question you should be asking. The partial decriminalisation model, on the other hand, decriminalises the exploited and only the exploited. And that's obviously the model to go for. I mean, it's a no-brainer for me. And I can't imagine why we need to talk for more than a few minutes on the subject of decriminalisation. I don't see why it needs more than that very brief breakdown that I've just given, because anybody should be able to see that we shouldn't be decriminalising exploiters. And in fact, I haven't heard a call for the full decriminalisation of exploiters in any other arena of life. You don't hear about that when it comes to the sweatshops or, the world is heaving with different forms of exploitation and brutality. And I don't hear about the full decriminalisation of exploiters in any other arena, which I think really speaks to where women are positioned in this world. So I think I've taken up enough of the floor already. We have a Q&A session at the end of this conversation, but I'd like to open just briefly by asking each of the participants one question each to get the conversation going. And for you, Audrey, thanks very much for joining us. I'd like to ask what your particular perspectives are when it comes to previously incarcerated women and youth in the city of Boston, where you live, and how the fully decriminalised model would affect those women and girls.
Well, here in Boston, one of the things that I'm proud to say, and here in Massachusetts, the whole state of Massachusetts, for years, we have stopped arresting adolescent girls, meaning girls under the age of 18, and charging them with prostitution. So we're pretty much a leader in that. But our women are still, and when I say our women, what I mean is if a girl is, 17, she's not arrested, but the same that same girl, when she turns 18 and she gets arrested, I mean, she gets caught up in a sting, right? Now she's arrested. And the problem that I have with that is that for that population of young people, young adults, we're talking young adults who are exploited as children, never found a way out, right? And then all of a sudden they go from being a victim to being like a perpetrator, you know what I mean? Or being a criminal, when in most cases, this young person was forced, coerced, manipulated into being in this life. And right now today, when I think of adult women who have changed their lives, and due to incarcerations over and over again, all these misdemeanor, because right, they're all misdemeanor charges, but there are a lot of women, adult women in our penal system who are doing 2 years, 3 years, like they're doing a lot of prison time for nonviolent misdemeanor crimes. And as you said, Rachel, when you talk about the partial decrim, right, I'm willing to fight. I want to fight. This should not be happening to these women, because it's causing them not to get housing, jobs, education. And so for me, that's a real problem. Like, no one should be held back or have like all these misdemeanor charges, right? Like, it's, as far as I'm concerned, we have people who are committing horrific crimes, right? That should be in those cells, that they have these victims, and whether they're victims of exploitation as adults, some of them are victims of substance abuse, right? And mental illness, right? And so a lot of these women, instead of getting the treatment that they need and the support and housing and programmings that they need, they're throwing them in jail cells. And so that's a real problem here in Massachusetts. And that's a problem that we continue to fight, because as I said earlier, anyone under 18 does not get arrested or charged with prostitution in Massachusetts. But it's our women who, for a lot of them, just came from a vicious cycle and think that there's no other way out for them, because they were conditioned and they were taught from children that this is all that they were good for.
Mm-hmm. You know, what you've just said has reminded me of, Audrey, is the way, because, I was in prostitution from I was 15 till I was 22. And if you had to try to arrest me for something at 15, 16, you couldn't have, unless you were arresting me for prostitution itself, you couldn't have arrested me for anything, unless it was a little bit of hash in my handbag or something, because I wasn't doing anything untoward other than trying to survive back then. But if you had got me a hold of me at 19, 20, oh God, I was completely wild, and I was breaking all sorts of laws, and some of them serious laws, on a very regular basis. But that was because I had been enculturated into the life at that point, and everything else that comes with it. So I'm wondering how that would translate to the situation that you've just outlined in Boston, where, okay, they're not arresting minors, but the circus is still continuing, so that the point comes where they are arrestable, they are over 18, well, then there's a whole lot there to arrest them for. So I wonder, like, coming back to the question about how this would impact on young girls and women, if you can imagine Boston flipping the situation as it is in Boston into the full decriminalization model that's being called for by a lot of groups, including Amnesty International, Black Lives Matter, shockingly, amazingly, groups like this are putting their name to the concept of that model. You would have a situation where the men who are preying on these women and girls would have no legal recourse. So I'm just wondering, how would you envision Boston? What would Boston look like under that model? That's a great question. Here's what we have to be clear about. When we have all of these folks saying, like, let's do, full decrim, let's be real clear. A lot of those women are upper middle class white women, right, who have a choice. They don't have to be in the life.
what saddens me is if we did a full decrim, the demand, because all men don't buy sex, but let's just look at it this way. Let's just say this many men buy sex today, right? With a full decrim, that's gonna increase the demand. So you'll go from here to this huge demand that you have to fill. Who do you think will fill that demand? Who are pimps going after to fill that demand? They're going after children of color who have no choice and women of color who don't have any choice. And when you look at these women who have done time in prison, adult women who might feel like, hey, I can't get a regular job anyway, right? And so predators, that's who they're gonna target. It will be folks who don't have a choice. And people need to understand who's doing all the yelling about a full decrim and who isn't. The majority of those folks, the women, most of them are educated women who have a choice. And so our children and women of color will continue to be victimized. And when I think of what is happening in the world today, I have to be real honest. With the full decrim, what's real disturbing, now we're gonna give white men permission to buy our brown girls and children too. Now they can buy us, like really? And so for me, that's very, very disturbing. And believe me, a full decrim with pimps, they know who to target. They're going after the vulnerable. Most of the exploiters aren't going after those upper middle class white women who have a choice. They're going after the ones who don't, because you will have to fill that demand. And to me, that's very, very disturbing.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more, Audrey, especially looking at how this model has played out in New Zealand, which was where it was forced, not where it was forced conceptualized, but where it was forced actually enacted. And everything you're describing has happened there already. I mean, I visited New Zealand. I went there to see this for myself with my own eyes. Saw the huge preponderance of young married girls and women lying in the streets. You know, an obvious racial imbalance that was really strange when you consider the tiny native population in New Zealand compared to the white population. And then in the indoor situation with the brothels and the escort agencies and the subs and all of that, that's sex worker owner operated brothels, for anyone who hasn't heard that term. There's a huge proliferation there of Asian women, Chinese, Thai, Korean women. So we've already seen this. The point has already been made, and more people just need to know about it and get talking about it, because prostitution, from when I look at the United States system of prostitution, to me it's racism and sexism combined. It's the two just entwined. It's an entwinement of the two, and they are inseparable. And I think it's shocking to me that it's not more broadly discussed in the United States. But thanks very much, Audrey. Cherie, I'm going to come to you next because you share the same city, and I was thinking that you must have had thoughts that popped into your head while Audrey was talking there.
Oh, so many of them. I think, you know, and I think when I hear this, you know, growing, you know, position of total decriminalization and normalizing prostitution and, you know, endorsing it, you know, I just wish they could just sit in our programs and listen to the life stories of the women that come through there. There's somehow this disconnect. I have to believe this because it really is hard for some of us, and I know Audrey would agree, coming from the same city and hearing these stories and how, and understanding, and for me too, I was in prostitution decades ago, right? And I've been doing these programs for a while now, and it's sort of like given me an opportunity to witness something here and to witness how brutal the sex trade has become. And I can say that as an older woman now, and that's a fact. So it really is hard for me to understand it, all of this, and also the other piece here is how badly young women are growing up in the US, in this country of, where you would think that everyone would have access to things. It is worsened. Marginalization, racial disparities, everything about it is worsened. And so I sit with these women, and that's where I feel like some of these women who promote this prostitution as sex work, do they hear from these young women? How can they not pay attention to the fact that, like for us, we see over 50% come out of failed systems in the US, rendered homeless at 18, ill-equipped for the world, do not have access to things. What is total decrim going to do for these young women? Did people ever ask that? What are they going to do? What is going to happen is going to make them even more invisible and more marginalized. It's almost like saying, okay, you are already disposable. Are we that individualistic in the US now, which we are becoming that? We see, from all around the world, you see what's happening and the madness in our country. But are we that, uncaring to say, oh, because prostitution worked for me and we need to promote this, that you don't see the hundreds and hundreds of women in these communities that are being brutalized by this? That's what I don't understand, because I come out of a time too in the 70s, and I remember the sex work that language was coming about, and Audrey was right. It was very much promoted by, very upper class white women, but it's starting to where the people are buying into this from so many different places. And that's where I have to feel like, I understand, that people and the fight here in the US about, are criminalizing everything. But people really need to understand what's going to happen here if we do this total decriminalization. And what would the impact they would have on that? I can't understand that. In the lives of these women, and because we do these programs here in Boston, which are so few in the country that deal with the over 18, that are really survivor-led, comprehensive, have a safe home. Because for me, when I left with nothing, like so many women, right? The brutality of all stayed with me, and it stays with you. So there's no recognition in this total decrim narrative of the need to even address these issues. So we're just gonna just not even recognize that we have to change the racial and gender disparities and everything that's going on in this country, and recognizing how now we are almost becoming a caste system, and that, okay, so it's okay for this population to just be rendered, into a brutal sex trade. It's just mind-blowing to me that we are that uncaring and and we know we're misinformed in the US. And Rachel, you talked about how people really don't understand this, and sometimes people might be just not getting it and well-intentioned, because it's hard for us to really, we have a culture now that we don't really understand things very well. We don't get to the root problems of things. And we are guided by this brutal, sort of capitalist system that it's all about money. It's all about ourselves. So that's, that's where I'm going with this. I wish that people could just hear from so many people that are so impacted by this, and the level of violence, and how come violence is increased in the US here. What's going on here? Because I see it and I witness it and I listen to these young women, and it's a much different sex trade than when I was in it decades ago. So where is it going to go if we promote this total decriminalization and open market of prostitution? What would happen in 10, 20 years, especially in this intergenerational prostitution, where you're going to have, prostitution for most of us was just a continuum of violence that started early on, right? So now you're going to have this whole population, an intergenerational population too, that has been this cycle of violence is just going to continue. It's just absurd to me.
And I'm wondering, Cherie, do you have any tips for people listening on how they actually approach this with people who either are genuinely clueless or are deliberately clueless, which is a far more toxic thing? And I guess those are two different questions. So you'd be looking at giving me two different answers. Like, how do you personally approach these people when you have somebody coming at you talking about the benefits of decriminalizing the sex trade?
Well, that's where I try to get them, you know, because we can't, I mean, like I said, I would love them to come and sit and listen to these women's lives. Well, that's not, we don't have the ability to do that. So, you know, I try to explain to people, because we as a program, we witness this and we try to use data from our program, sort of evidence-based statistics to say who's impacted, how, you know what I mean? And the life stories of people coming through, because I want to hear from those people who promote this, what they think about this. How do they think that decriminalization, total decriminalization, is going to change or make their life better? And oftentimes people don't have an answer for that because they go back to their own individualistic story and promotion. They don't seem to grasp the concept of, okay, but you have, and like Audrey pointed out, so you have a small percentage of people that maybe will say, and there was a time in my life when I said, okay, I can do this, because we all do that. We buy into this, otherwise we couldn't continue to engage in prostitution. But then we have to understand what happens. Has it improved our lives? Did it improve my life? At the end, I was a heroin addict and I had to like hide to get out of things. This is what happens at the end. So why are we promoting something that is going to worsen people's lives? And they can sit there and maybe say, for now, it works. Yes, you know, you can make money. That's the lure. Absolutely. But the fact that the harm it does in you know, in the brutality and the harm that comes out of this, erasing even all the other stuff that goes along with prostitution and, you know, being in these like really violent, coercive relationships, you know, buyers and having to deal with sexual assault and rape and all the things that we've been exposed to. But just using ourselves as in prostitution is such a harmful thing. And that's why most of us end up so, you know, after a while, it takes a long time to heal from that. So we are promoting this as a way of, that's what's so mind-blowing, and trying to get people to understand that. And it has worked, I think, sometimes when I talk about, you take away, because there's just so many myths and misconceptions. People thinking you can make money, this is okay, it's right, you know, that old argument. But I think what people don't grasp is take away, because they do this distinction between trafficking and that's brutal and, oh, but there's this other, it's choice. But it doesn't matter any of that. It's just what has happened in whether you've been trafficked, whether you got in by, you know, a choice when there was no choice. We still at the end, how come so many of us were using substances so heavily at the end? How come we left with nothing? How come some of us had to hide? We had to recreate our entire life and step out of something. We were so far from what was normal in anything, and just in trying to get people to understand that, because even creating our exit program was really, really difficult. And I don't even think I realized how hard it is, because what I didn't realize is how entrenched women are now and how much harder it is to get out. So when I explain it to people like that, sometimes they hear it. Sometimes people shut down, people don't want, do you know what I mean? It's like, you know, or sometimes it makes it difficult because when we recognize something, then we have to fix it.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, you've made so many points there, Cherie, but the one that really sticks out to me, and I was only thinking about this morning, was the way that, for me, as you know, I was homeless at 15, which is why I got in. I was homeless in the physical sense that I was sitting on a park bench. But 7 years later, I was homeless in a much more serious sense. I was homeless within myself. I was a narcotic addict, you know. I was, I swapped really one kind of a prison for another. And what I came to realize was that I was in a situation where the solution was a hell of a lot more toxic than the original problem. And I think that that's a case that people are just not looking at and desperately need to understand.
Yes, and then how, Rachel, just think of this too, and how it is impacted. A lot of us had children. During it was impacted my ability to really connect with people, my own children. I couldn't be a whole person. And that's
a very painful thing that we don't enough talk about, I think.
Can I just add too, can I add one thing to that? For me, being a survivor, the most painful piece, and I've been in recovery for a long time, substance abuse for over 27 years. I've recovered from a lot of stuff in this process. But one of the things that I will never recover from is the fact that when you talk about relationships, I've been in love a couple of times in recovery, but because of the selling of my body over and over and over, right? Because these women aren't saying, we love having sex with strangers and we get paid, so why can't we do it? We're having a fabulous time. The only way that you can perform with men you don't even know, right? You think of yourself. If you had to sleep with 10 to 20 different strangers per night, right? You have to find a way to cope with that. So I learned how to disassociate real quick. And then when the drugs, what happened for me with substance abuse, I found it was a way to disassociate from the act, right? And then I come into recovery. I'll never forget when I got clean. And my first sexual experience with someone I had been with for a while, who I thought I had a fabulous sex life with, I remember I felt nothing. What I was later to find out, I thought it was the drugs. I thought, oh, maybe you have to be high to have sex. Only later to find out in doing this work, I developed dissociative disorder sexually. That's one of the most painful pieces of being in the life. And let me be real clear. Those symptoms don't occur when you're in the life. So the women who are saying, and the people who are saying, you know, do a full decrim, they don't even know what the traumas are until you come out of the life. So I have yet to have a intimate sexual relationship, right, in 2 marriages that I've had in recovery, because my body doesn't know the difference between having sex with someone I love and want to have sex with and somebody by me. My body doesn't know the difference. And so before we start voting for a full decrim, I always say, we need a study. Let's see how folks are doing when they come out of the life, when the symptoms occur. The trauma, those symptoms, the real symptoms, do not occur until you leave and you try to lead a healthy life. And that's one of the most painful pieces for me. And the only reason why I talk about it, because I want people to understand that the human body is not made to have sex over and over again with people you don't know, and you think they're gonna come out of that okay? I don't think so. I don't think so.
That you wouldn't give the time of day to if you met anywhere else, just to finish that sentence for you, Audrey. Because, you know, a woman asked me recently, a while back, I've had similar questions, as I'm sure you all have, you know, what it was really like, you know, and it's such, it's a difficult question to take sometimes, because it's actually quite insulting in the essence of itself, because I think, well, it was exactly like for me what it was exactly like for you. Do you know what I mean? So what I put to her was, I told her to, next time she was in a cafe or a bar or anywhere out in the open, take a look around, and every single man she saw, just imagine that she had to service him. Didn't matter, the man beside her on the bus, the walking down the street, whatever. And you know, you see then this slow dawn in horror in a woman's eyes when even the idea of prostitution begins to sink in, never mind the actuality. But that was a really important point, Audrey, about the trauma. And you know, there's multiple forms, so we'll come back to that. There's obviously the sexualized trauma, that's first and foremost. For me, like touching back to something Cherie mentioned, it was the hurt of not being able to be a good mother, and knowing that I wasn't able to be a good mother and not knowing how to do anything about it. That was very, very painful for me, because I gave birth bang in the middle of those 7 years. And I shouldn't have been taking care of a goldfish, quite honestly, never mind a child. So I want to come on to you next, Mickey, and ask you from your position in Cape Town in South Africa, how you feel that the full decriminalization model would impact on women in the developing world. And everything, by the way, that really goes along with that, sex tourism and the whole lot. Because we know that that would explode overnight.
Oh, so yeah, good evening, everybody, and thank you for having me. You know, it baffles me sometimes how this, when the question of decriminalization comes up, or partial decriminalization, where we eliminate men and the pimps and we focus directly on women. And I'm saying this because there was a webinar yesterday that actually spoke about how criminalization will not deter people from selling sex. Now it's just mainly talking about people from selling sex. And what we are trying to stop is not necessarily people selling sex, but we are trying to stop, because the people that are selling sex are doing so because there is a demand. Just like Cherie and Audrey had said previously, that demand creates a market. So it kind of like baffles me. But what I know that full decriminalization, and this is from my personal experiences and that of the women that I have spent time working with for years, that full decriminalization, the only thing it will change for us is that it will get the police off our backs, but it will not change the fact that we are at high risk of men's violence against women, especially in a country like South Africa, where we have declared gender-based violence and femicide as a crisis. We have women dying on a daily basis in this country. And these are women dying at the hands of the men who are their intimate partners, known men, some their parents. So this is the situation. What full decriminalization is actually going to do, it's going to put us in a situation where it provides no other options for poor Black women especially. And like you mentioned earlier on, we cannot talk about the issue of the system of prostitution without mentioning racism, class, sexism as well. And so we are sitting with a situation where Black women, in particular in South Africa, are the face of those who are bought, sold, and exploited within the system of prostitution. So what that is going to do is that it's going to put us in a position where we are at the mercy of the hands of the men who purchase us within the system of prostitution, the pimps and the brothel keepers. So full decriminalization would be a disaster for, especially for poor Black women in the Republic of South Africa, as well as in Cape Town as well. So that's what it would do. But there is also a question that came privately that do men have the right or claim to have the right to be having sex? And I'm just throwing that in because somebody texted that to me directly who's also watching, that do men ever claim the right to purchase sex? Do they have this right? Does any person have the right to purchase another person? Maybe we should start, talking about the fact that when we talk about human rights, whose human rights are we actually talking about? Are we talking about the rights of those who are bought, sold, and exploited within the system? Or are we talking about the rights of those with power and control and those who are buying and selling women for their own gratification, be it financially or sexually?
You know, it's rare, Mickey, that men have the bald nerve to actually claim the right publicly. And I think in most instances that I've ever seen, they allude to some kind of extenuating circumstances, like the man who was physically disabled that I saw on television a few years ago. He was an Englishman. So he was about like 3 foot tall. And, I don't know what the name of his condition was, but he was physically disabled and dwarfism or whatever it's called. I'm not sure if he was a wheelchair user as well. He may have been. But his whole thing was, I'm disabled and therefore, I need this service. And I was thinking, well, if ever I'd seen a really classic case of somebody who was from one a disadvantaged group, actually thinking that they had a right then to use another disadvantaged group because of their disadvantaged status. It was just bizarre. And nobody thought to put that to him on the panel, unfortunately.
Can I add something to that? I don't know who you all are seeing, but I don't see men on the forefront saying, we like to buy people, could you decrim that? What I see are those privileged men funding those organizations behind the back door and again, using women to advocate for their privilege. Because I don't know what other people are saying, but I'm not seeing of white men saying, listen, decriminalize because we want to buy people. And that says a lot too, that they are not in the forefront of this movement, and that though, like, people don't understand, right? Because they're just taking the funding, right? And we know, like, the porn industry is, you know, putting up a lot of money, that men, again, are using women, right, to advocate. The men aren't saying a word. You know what I'm saying? So.
Oh yeah, it's just, they're just like, it's a matter of mouthpieces, really, is the way you'd put that one. It's
Can I just come in there, please, Rachel, and just add to that, Audrey, that as well in the brothels, there's not men sat in the reception area. There's women fronting them, and they're often very white privileged businessmen who own the establishments, but they will put a woman in the face of the reception. And of course, we know the vast majority will be women in the rooms. And again, I know many women who got out of actually laying on the backs by going into reception work, which, you know, nobody's going to advocate any of it, but sometimes you're desperate and you know, you can't lay on your back anymore for whatever reason. And they're the ones charged with owning brothels and brothel keeping, not the men, again, invisible men.
Fiona, I have a question for you. So decriminalisation as a legal structure, it exists in New Zealand and a couple of states in Australia. But the closest thing to it that we've yet seen in your part of the world is the Leeds managed zone, which is actually very near where you live. So I just wanted you to tell us what the impact of that zone was and how that panned out.
Yeah, much to my absolute horror, the city that I as a child were prostituted in 2014 endorsed an idea of a alleged managed zone where there were no law, no legislation at all, but there were rules. They had to follow rules, and that was that you could curb crawl between the hours of 6 p.m, 6 a.m. in a particular zone that was actually really industrial, so very dark, very isolated areas, bordering on a neighbourhood, so the impact of that neighbourhood as well was massive. And the women who were on the streets, they could solicit themselves between the hours of 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. And if they were caught, literally, you know, there's a lamppost separating the managed from the unmanaged areas, and you would be arrested, the women outside of that. And there have been women arrested outside of that. As far as I'm aware, there's been no men arrested.
Wasn't that run as a pilot initially, Fiona?
Pardon?
Wasn't that run as a pilot initially?
It was run as a year's pilot, and then Leeds City Council very kindly endorsed that as a success, when in fact there was a young Polish woman, 23-year-old young woman, found brutally murdered in the managed zone. And there were several reports of violence and abuse attacks, you know, brutal attacks, which all of us on this panel know exactly what that means in reality. Because when we trim it up and write the language in the newspapers, the you know, for people's entertainment or voyeuristic reasons, we don't name the violence. We don't really talk about what that violence is. And the men who are perpetrating this violence are absolutely not accountable for. So that's the first absolutely horrific thing that happened, is that they endorsed it as a success when a woman had been murdered. That just speaks volumes to me about the absolute disregard for the women and girls. And by the way, the vast majority are exactly the same women as you describe, as the previous speakers have described, Audrey, Mickey and Cherie, and you, Rachel. So, you know, impoverished women. Many of the women in the zone don't speak English. They're from Eastern Europe. So there's no way they have jumped on a plane, train or automobile and found themselves in a tiny little spot in Leeds that is a managed zone. There's no way they have. They can't speak English. So they're definitely being trafficked here.
Yeah. So it's orchestrated and organised, is what you're saying, regardless.
Oh, without a doubt. We, you know, there's neighbours that neighbourhood group that do a lot of campaigning to shut this down, and the impact on them. You know, the grooming of their children on their way to schools, the activities in their neighbourhoods, literally visible to all families at all times of day. Often again, they will get angry with the women because the women are the visible thing. So all the attacks are on the women, all the slurs are on the women. They are so horrible about them women. And then on the other side of that, we've got harm reduction model. So we go into white middle class women largely working in these so-called health projects, and they're actually literally colluding with the absolute abuse of these women by providing harm reduction, which is condoms and clean works and a cup of tea in a van, you know, and the women have to literally beg them for support to exit. And I can tell you that because I know women who I work with women now. You know, I'm friends with women now who actually begged for support to exit and got zilch. But interestingly, COVID-19 happens. And let me just read you what a member, it doesn't say which member, of course, again, invisible, not accountable, not putting your name out there and your face out there like we have for years and years, decades. We've had our families affected by that. We've had our lives affected by that in every single way. But these people still remain anonymous who make decisions about these women. And I can't talk about, you know, you're so calm, you women. I am absolutely blowing my stack after 25 years. You know, I hold my hand up to you women who are still there, because honestly, my head is going to explode if somebody doesn't wake up, stand up, and erase this bullshit notion that we are for sale. But just let me quote it. So, Leeds City Council issued new guidelines in March 2020 due to COVID. A spokesman for Leeds City Council said, "It is clear that allowing women to solicit for sex at a certain time in public places is contrary to national and scientific guidance associated with COVID-19. And as such, the delivery and strategic and operational administration of the managed approach must change immediately."
Isn't it amazing, Fiona, that, you know, so this one form of health shuts the whole thing down like a house of cards falling in on itself, but the women's health is not worth any kind of damn, even when they're lying there dead in the middle of the managed zone. You know, and I think, you know, I remember you telling me some time ago that managed zone started out life known as the safe zone, which they had to change the name of after that, a horrible tragedy.
Yeah.
I have one more question for you, Fiona. And I probably shouldn't ask this for the sake of your blood pressure. Can you imagine if the entirety of Britain were to go down the full decrim route? You'd be looking at a nationwide managed zone. What do you think that would mean for young women and girls in working class Britain?
Well, basically, their career choices would be non-existent, because the only road they're going down is into the gutter to be objectified, abused, raped, tortured for, wait for it, 2 seconds pleasure for these men. 2 seconds out of their fancy privileged lives, their fancy privileged jobs and cars and children and wives. 2 seconds pleasure. We will throw every vulnerable girl and young woman under that bus. And as far as I'm aware, I've said this a billion times, as far as I'm aware, no man's died of never getting access to a vagina. As far as I'm aware, no heads ever blown off. The heads don't blow off, you know, but it's as if this weapon of mass destruction, you know, that they can't control, they can't hold, they've got no control over. We have to sell out very, very vulnerable girls and women. Makes me sick, makes me sick. And we are not civilized society. We're a disgrace. We're an international disgrace.
Well, you couldn't be clearer than that. Thanks very much, Fiona. Audrey, I have a question for you that's come in directly for you. And it says, unfortunately, it's not only the white privileged people who call for the decrim in US, the movement for Black Lives and other Black, Brown-led so-called progressive movements. How do we get these leaders, especially Black women, not to embrace the sex trade? Is it fear, or what's going on here, and how do women rectify that situation?
And that's an excellent question. I was invited on the webinar. One of the points that I wanted to make to Black Lives Matter, like, if Black lives really matter, are you saying that that Black Lives Matter, but it's okay for privileged white men to buy them, right? One of the things we have to have people understand, first of all, a woman of color is not held as to the same level as a white woman. Let me be real clear. And what I would want them to understand, first of all, Black women a Black woman has to lay on her back and turn even more tricks than a white woman does, right? The violence that occurs, women of color are experiencing more violence. Just to give you an example, one of the things that I would say, I remember someone said to me that, you know, the police pulled her over. She was with a Black girl, she's white, pulled them over, put them in the police car, and said to the white woman, said to the Black woman, I know why you're out here. But then says to the white woman, but I don't know why you're out here, right? And let the white woman go, right? And arrested the woman of color. So one of the messages that I would let them know is that women of color, particularly Black Lives Matter, are definitely abused and raped at a higher rate than white women, are definitely incarcerated more than white women for the same so-called crime, right? And so for me to talk with these people, I would want them to understand, yes, we don't want to arrest our women. But I have to say, yeah, there are some women of color caught up in this, but my experience has been, it was white women who started it. I remember being in DC to testify when they were trying to pass it in DC. And I remember seeing these young Black kids, they looked to be like college students, right? Because the people who were against the full decrim were on one side of the room, and the folks, you know, the trans folks and how they made these young Black, young college age Black students believe that this was okay, right? And does a lot of that come from, again, even in my work, I've been getting in touch with agreeing on stuff because as a Black woman, I didn't really have a voice, right? And so I've agreed with a lot of my white coworkers around some stuff that I really didn't agree with, right? Just to be on the team, or just to, right? Or just to kind of fit in and not be different. And so, again, Cherie said it. We're in a society, people, where people want to decriminalize everything. That's like where we're at. Everything needs to be decriminalized. Again, it goes back to the harm. And I do want to go back, and hopefully when Black Lives Matter, just so happened that night I could not be on that webinar, because my first point to make to them, are you saying, because I believe too, when we say decrim, for instance, people aren't looking at, what I need people to understand, this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So what I want to be real clear about, if there's anyone on this webinar who has money and has your nice little fancy house, I want to tell you that this is a crime that is a multi-billion-dollar industry, which means, let's be real clear, brothels aren't going to be in the hood. We're talking about they make more money than you, which means they can buy the house right next door to you, open up a brothel for you, your children, your neighbors' children to see. They have the money and the power to do that. And so we have to let people know the full picture, because just because Black Lives are saying Black Lives Matter, the full decrim, they don't get it either. I couldn't even imagine being the head of, being a Black woman saying it's okay to give white men, and let's be real clear, the majority of buyers are upper middle class white men who are married with families, to give them to give the okay, go buy up our women of color and our children of color. So what that tells me is those organizations, and they're ignorant to what this really means as well. And they don't even get it. The brown people are going to pay the highest price. They're going to pay the highest price in this.
That's
Just
exactly
like yeah, just like in our society, the police brutality and all the harm, Black women in the sex trade will not be treated the same as white women. And that's just the way that goes.
Well,
Pretty Woman, the film Pretty Woman didn't do much to help the matter neither. You know, Hollywood glamorization of a white, allegedly attractive human, and his little white chick, which of course is not really at all a true representation of what is going on, Audrey, and what you speak of. But the world watches that, and I can't believe people don't look beyond that. It's apparently one of the best films ever. You know, it's in Broadway now. It's off Broadway. It's in the West End as a musical. You know, do me a favor.
I honestly never, I never could take it seriously enough to be annoyed about it, Fiona. I always thought
sadly, the world does take it serious, Rach. Absolutely. But
sadly,
it
was so absurd. I mean, from our perspective, looking from within the sex trade, it to me was just, it was like getting annoyed about a cartoon or something. That's just where my head went to. I never support or endorse it, obviously, but to me it was just silly to get myself wound up about. But Audrey, I want to come back to, just because there's one element to this question that I wanted to ask you about. So the second half of that question was, how can we get these leaders, especially Black women, to look at the reality of the sex trade? And I guess that's, how do we make that leap? Because, the thing for me as a white woman, I look at this situation and I say to myself, and I know that these are strong words, and in a political respect, they're probably dangerous words for a white woman to be saying, but they're also truthful words, you know, they're truthful words, Audrey, and that's where I have to come at it from. The sex trade in America is the closest thing to the plantation that the US society has to offer Black women in 2020. It's the closest thing. So how the hell do you get Black women leaders to see that and to rise up against it?
Well, like anything else, training and education, right? And so, and as you were talking, I was thinking about this panel. It is leading me to say we really need to reach out and see if they will make time, particularly like Black Lives Matter, for us to kind of really train them on the realities. The bottom line is the survivors that we know who have really suffered from this, we have to kind of bogart our way in through training and, like Cherie said, hearing the true stories, because there are some women that are who have been out like a year or so, right? The women that Cherie sees, and because we only have like a couple of organizations that serve adult women, and we have to kind of figure out a way to bust their door down and be heard. They need to hear the harm that was caused. They need to really attend a training, because they don't get it. They don't get the vicious cycle. And again, whether they're Black women or white women, they're listening to women who have not taken a thorough beating. And then the flip side of that is they're listening to women who have not made it out, so they don't even know what the trauma entails, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing I want to touch on, we talked about this when we were talking about this meeting, and not that I go around saying I'm sane, because I'm not too sure about that, right? But the bottom line is, a lot of women go in, right? They go into the life and somewhat, right, feeling like they're in the right state of mind. And I'm seeing so much mental illness that develops from these, right? Again, people, it's easy for me to say, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, full decrim. Have you ever laid on your back and turned 10 to 20 tricks a day? Have you ever done that? Do you really even know what that's about? Because clearly, they're not hearing from who they need to hear from, the people who lived it. Because most of my time in the life, yeah, when I was brought in, it was by my daughter's father, put me on the street corner, blah, blah, blah. But for most of the years, I was out there on my own, thinking I'm doing my own thing. I ain't giving nobody my money. I talked about the women that did shit. I don't live that way. But boy, oh boy, when I came out, right, and put those drugs down, and I started oozing and leaking trauma, that's when I got in touch with the harm that the life has caused me. So whether it's legal, full decrim or not, no one can sleep with a bunch of people. And people on this, you imagine yourself that's on this webinar, I'm gonna say this again. Imagine you meeting someone. This is the best way I'm gonna break this down for you. Imagine you meeting someone. No, imagine your partner. You love your partner. You love having sex with your partner. Imagine that same partner saying to you, listen, babe, I need for you to have sex with me 10 to 20 times a day. Now, this is someone you love to have sex with, right? Now, no one can humanly do that. And if you can, inbox me. I want to hear about it, because I want to hear about that. Now, if you can't imagine yourself having sex with your partner that you love having sex with 10 to 20 times a day, how can anyone think that someone loves sleeping with strangers, men that they don't even know? And on the trans piece, a lot of the men that are buying are trans women. They're married men, married to women, buying even our trans women of color. And they're already being murdered at a high rate just for being trans brown women, okay? So imagine. And anybody who buys people, this is not a regular job where all of a sudden society will respect them because they're prostitutes. The only way you can buy someone is to think that they're not human. Your mindset has to be that you're not buying a human being. So you just can't, and these are the things, the bottom line, you all, is that we have to bust down some of these barriers and get in, particularly like Black Lives Matter, like organizations like that. We have to figure out how to bust down some doors and have them hear us out. And I'm talking women who've been out for years. And I also think some of the adult women who are suffering from substance abuse, mental health, who might have only been out a year, I think that their voices need to be heard if they're willing to do that too. And we got to figure out how to do that because they're not getting Cherie said it. They don't have the full story.
The other thing I want to add to Audrey, because you know this, in the US too, I mean, look who comes to our programs, majority of women of color. Most of them aged out of these broken systems, grew up in residential settings. And where's the disconnect? There's a disconnect here. And if they could hear these voices and we can get these women organized in a sense, the challenge here, because we wanted to organize, we didn't want to do services. But the challenge in all of this is we come out of that takes so long to heal and get your life and recreate your life. You know what I mean? It's a challenge doing this, but there's that lack of those voices, especially of these young women, their lives. When I listen to them, I'm appalled about what's happening. I can't, and I think that somehow we have to get those voices out there.
Exactly, Cherie. Exactly. And they need to be heard. These people they got to hear.
Yeah.
Because if I'm on my high horse, listen, when I was in a life doing my own thing, you said it, I'd probably be like, yeah, do a full decrim too. Well, I didn't, because at that time I didn't realize how broken I was.
Right.
I had drugs to cover up the side effects of it. You know what I'm saying? So.
Well, decrim would have suited us all down to the ground when we were in a position in our lives where we were only looking as far as ourselves and as far as the next day, you know. We certainly weren't being altruistic when it came to society more broadly, what was good for society. I mean, if any one of you gave a damn about what was good for society at the time, hats off to you, because I certainly didn't, you know, wouldn't even crossed my mind. But there's a whole philosophical argument to be got into there about, you know, the quagmire of self-involvedness, you know, that you end up in that situation. But Mickey, I wanted to ask you about the African context in particular, and a bit about, I know a woman who does frontline in Kenya, and she described the Kenyan coast to me and the way that it's broken up, the coastline, the sex tourism zone is broken up by nationality. And to my shame as a European woman, they're all European nationalities. So it's the German, English and French speaking zones, as far as I'm aware. There may possibly be Italian also, but I wouldn't swear to that. But there's 3 or 4 languages. So they actually have these zones set up so that to cater to languages that the sex buying tourist men are speaking. And now I'm looking at that situation, which is just so repulsive and disgusting, and just trying to imagine how, if the pimping and the brothel keeping was fully decriminalized, a situation like that would be replicated in numerous different places across Africa, and including, of course, South Africa. And I'd like to ask what you have to say about that in a particular context. So, you know, there's I'm trying to remember whether it's called the Piece 19, Unit 19, but it's 19 anyway of the Prostitution Reform Act, so in New Zealand. And the push has been on for some years now. They haven't got there yet, but they probably will, to collapse that particular segment of legislation. And that's the piece that makes it illegal for people from abroad to be involved in prostitution in New Zealand. So basically, by the back door, if this is struck down, it will decriminalize sex trafficking. The language of sex trafficking is not even used, by the way, in the PRA. But when I heard about that, I was imagining what that would mean in other contexts if it made its way around the globe. So you would be talking about a situation there where sex trafficking was just rampant, and decriminalized de facto. And I wonder how that would, what do you envision would happen if you were to transpose the New Zealand situation onto South Africa in that regard?
So from what I've learned, actually, when I was in New Zealand 9 years ago, and from the women who were prostituted prior to the law being passed and during the time of the law, was that the first and foremost, the law did not protect them from the violence that they were experiencing. The only thing it did, it protected them from being chased by the police, but also the fact that some brothels, there's a clause in that law, right, that says only 4 people can operate without being regulated, and then 4 and above. So you have one pimp that has different houses where 4 women are operating. So you have one pimp with 40 women, but in different locations. So they don't follow this law. But with regards to the Kenyan situation, there is one thing that I was thinking about 2 days ago, that whenever it is that the colonizer gets to a space and they want to colonize the locals, they do as they please with them. That is the situation that we have with the Dutch coming down to South Africa, with them with all the colonizers coming to the rest of Africa. I am envisioning a situation where there would be an influx. Already, right now, as we speak, South Africa is 3 things. It is the destination, the source, and the transit country for human trafficking. And we know that those who are trafficked, majority of them are women, and for the sole purposes of sexual exploitation, commercialized sexual exploitation, which is the system of prostitution. So I am envisioning, if we were to decriminalize with the situation that is already happening in Kenya, in Mombasa, in that sex tourism part, I'm envisioning a situation where we would have a country that brings in women. We would have trafficking and a high rise of trafficking within the borders of South Africa between our provinces, because we have provinces that are very rural and are very poor, where I'm envisioning that we would be bringing these innocent girls from the village, because there would be a demand for the sex tourists that are coming to South Africa, demanding for rural girls, and what they would make out of what a Black woman should be coming from Europe. And this is also motivated, or this is influenced by the history of Sarki Batman, where, Europeans found her very fascinating, the way she's built and everything. So I'm envisioning all those men who were actually, looking at Sarki Batman, paying to look at her back in the day, coming down to South Africa and coming to explore, coming down to Africa to come and explore what they think, or their curiosity of what they think Black women should be about.
So what you're talking about really is a perfect storm then of exploitation and objectification, racial objectification, very specifically. And I think that's the inevitable upshot, Mickey. Thank you for that. And then, the free-for-all as well, which is why we named this webinar as we did, the Wild West of Prostitution, because it's a form of prostitution with no legal penalties whatsoever applied. And like you mentioned about the subs in New Zealand, so it's 4 women or less, and there's absolutely in that situation 0 legal requirement for any kind of regulation, or even inspection. So like Audrey said earlier on, then they can set up next door, and next door could be anywhere. And there's no way then of even calculating how many brothels you have in the nation. Never mind knowing where they are.
I actually saw a ridiculous sign in one of those brothels that I visited that said, condoms are a legal requirement. Please do not propose not to use one. You may be prosecuted. But during my time there, nobody was there to actually inspect whether or not the women or the men were propositioning not to use condoms. And then it brings me to thinking, what are these people talking about? This is so ridiculous, because it's just put up there so that people do know. But what happens behind closed doors is between the prostituted woman, who has no power to negotiate, because I normally say women in prostituted women do not normally get infected with HIV or any other sexually transmitted disease because there is a lack of condoms. They get infected because they lack the power to negotiate for use of that particular condom, whether it's or not.
Mm-hmm. Your connection went a bit funny there. I know where you were going with that, Mickey, because we've discussed this several times. For anybody who missed it, the point Mickey was making was that the women do not become infected with HIV for lack of condoms. They become infected for lack of the power and capital to use them, or to insist that the men use them, rather. So we've got about 15 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is just open the floor and invite everybody to take the opportunity to interject anywhere they want on any of the points that they've heard raised already. So maybe start with you, Fiona. Have you anything you'd like to kick in?
I'd just like to ask people to consider the occupational, what us women would see as occupational hazards, and how, if you were writing a job description and a person's specification for the sex work narrative, just what that would look like and how ridiculous that notion is. Because if you were to write that job description and we were to talk about the occupational hazards, which I know we've all touched on, it just blows it out of the water, really. And I also think we need to cut talking about this in frilled up language, which I know is what the pro-sex lobby use a lot. Language that sanitizes and legitimizes and normalizes what is actually a living hell. And every opportunity, anybody listening, challenge that language, tear it down, shut it down, because it's absolute rubbish, and when we sanitize and normalize and deny the violence and hide all that, then it's like a utopia, which, we all know. And as you said earlier, Rachel, ask them to go do a shift in the brothel if they're really, really up for that. And they're the ones that are promoting, like, the projects in the UK. They're on significant salaries, these people. They're getting really good salaries. They barely even speak to these women.
They don't want to collapse the system, Fiona.
Yeah, and where the money goes, where does it go? It doesn't go in supporting exiting strategies. We are desperate, in need of well-resourced exiting strategies that women, and all your life. It's not a 6-week fix and off you go skipping into the sunset. This is lifelong hell, and you never know when your trigger's going to come. You never know what's going to trigger that. So there's loads of things I want to say. Thanks for listening, but most of all, cut the crap. Let's talk about it for what it is, which is the most horrendous form of violence and abuse a human being can experience.
Thank you, Fiona, and I'm glad you raised that point about the exiting, because there's a question just come in, and to everybody, all the people listening in, I have to apologise that we've had far more questions than we've had room to provide answers. But one of the really important questions that's just come in, and I wanted to put this to the women. are there any countries that provide sufficient assistance for women to leave prostitution? And I'll give my answer briefly, which is not to my awareness. And unfortunately, what we have is a situation where governments are not willing to put their money where their mouth is on this issue. They'll do it on any other issue just about, but not on this one, which again speaks to women's position in society. And what we're looking at there, as far as I'm concerned, in the European context, is an entwinement of sexism and classism, because women just, we just don't matter enough. And I think, if we look at the world through the prism of an alternate reality and imagine that it was men in this situation, we would see those kind of governmental financial provisions very, very quickly. But I'd like to put that to you all, what you have to say about the woeful lack of funding, lack of provision. Cherie, I know you see it every day.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, and it's absolutely a disgrace that this isn't being addressed. Because if we talk about total decrim, they're not even speaking about this, right? Because even in the US, there's a lot of misconceptions here too, because, here, like I said, we're almost in a caste system here because our, secondary education costs money. Housing is a lot of money. These young women that come through our programs do not have access to that. And if they came out of residential, they only went to maybe the 9th grade and in an underfunded school. There's this huge disparity going on. It's like and that's what I'm saying, and I see it over these years. Because when I exited out and I compare it from years back to now, and I see these young women, they don't have access anymore. Somehow and so it's really, it's unbelievable to me that there isn't recognition of that, the need of this. This is it's not even tolerable that there is no access here. And what it cost us, we spend a lot of money supporting, because when you leave with nothing, you have no money. So we have a solidarity fund. So we pay, we support women out. If we didn't have that, we couldn't even do this program, because you don't have access to what? To food, to whatever, to simple things. So I feel like in this notion of decriminalization, there would be no conversation about this, because they would think this is okay. The sex trade, yes, it's a viable option. And also the other thing I want to talk about a little bit, and I know we don't have much time, is this really dispelling this myth that decrim is going to make it safer. I see this argument constant. It's absurd to me. Fiona said there's a million things here we have to dispel, and it's hard to separate which is the one most important.
Well, I think that's probably the most important, because that's the biggest misconception that's driving this narrative, Cherie, where the reality is that decriminalising pimps and brothel keepers and johns actually, it pours petrol on what's already a bonfire. The idea that it makes it safer is absolutely absurd, because what it is doing is it's removing every legal penalty that stands in the way of women and those who want to financially or sexually exploit them. So how the hell does that make it safer? It makes zero sense. There's so much to be said about the experiment that has been New Zealand since 2003. So what's that now? 17 years we've had to look at this situation. It most certainly has not got safer. The women who provide frontline outreach services in New Zealand told me directly into my face that they used to be working with 6 to 8 women on the streets at night. I was a quiet little zone, K Road. Now they're dealing with 50 to 60, right? And this was only a couple of years ago we went over there. The idea was, look, where you expand the trade, as Audrey said earlier on, the first thing that happens is the demand goes through the roof. So does the amount of places that need to be filled. So does the harm and the damage. Everything increases alongside of decriminalization. It's absurd to think that you have a situation where the numbers go through the roof, the age groups go through the floor, by the way, demand is off the scale, and then all of a sudden the harm and the damage dissipates like a dispirin in a glass of water. How the hell does that happen? So, it winds me up, it really does. And briefly, I'd just like to mention another thing that's happening in New Zealand is somebody mentioned this earlier on, the social implications of decriminalising prostitution and what it does to a society more broadly. And that's another piece that we simply don't have time for, because we'd be an hour at least trying to cover that one. But you're talking about advertising on bus stops, within sight of schools, on buses themselves. It's the proliferation of the sex trade throughout society. It's another major piece of this that we haven't got time, like I said, to get into thoroughly, but I would definitely like people listening in to have a think about that and think about whether or not that's the kind of society they'd want to be raising their own kids in. So we just have a matter of about 5 minutes now, girls. So is there anything anybody would like to, really important points anybody would like to close on?
Yeah, I wanted to just, or what Cherie was saying and what you were saying about the pathetic argument that decriminalization of the system of prostitution will make prostitution safer. That I normally say in South Africa, we have the sex buyers are reputable men in society who do not want to be seen. And I normally say to people, you speak as if prostitution was decriminalized tomorrow, everybody would start having sex in the middle of the street. But where we are already having a situation where men are already claiming that it was consensual sex after they have raped the victim, we are going to sit with a situation where men are going to rape us, and then they are going to claim to have actually purchased access to our bodies. That is a very bad situation. And the only solution for us to make sure that men are penalized and are punished and face consequences and are deterred from violating women's bodies and objectifying women's bodies and commodifying women's bodies, we need to enact the equality model, because it is the only promising legal framework that is very progressive in protecting women and creating a safer environment for women to be able to live in a society that is free from commercialized and non-commercialized sexual exploitation.
Thank you for that, Mickey. We spent the last 90 minutes almost talking about the model that we're against and why. And we haven't spent much time talking about what we're for and why. And that is, as you said, the equality model, otherwise known as partial decriminalisation. So it's got several names now. We also call it the Nordic model, the abolitionist model. Basically what we're talking about, no matter what we call it, is the situation where women, girls, and anyone else exploited in the sex trade is decriminalised. And that's where the decriminalisation stops, because it should go no further than that, quite obviously. We better wrap it up now. Ladies, has anybody got anything else they'd like to say?
Well, I'll just add that we have to, where money needs to go is to treatment. I think of, in Massachusetts, I only know of three places where women can go. And Massachusetts is a huge state. That is nothing. That is nothing. And so when you hear all this talk of decrim, they're not even, no one's looking out for the underdog, meaning the underdog is really the majority of those women who, after a thorough beating, will need somewhere to go to recover from all the abuse that they endured, right? And so for me, it's more important, instead of a full decrim, that money should go into treatment for women. We already have, I mean, our system is broken, absolutely, but a child will always have a roof over their head if they're over 18, right? Under 18, right? It's a broken system, but it's a system, like a kid really doesn't have to be on the street, right? It's our women when they turn 18 and up that need somewhere to go to get the help that they need. And more importantly, to some women, young women, they don't even understand what happened to them. They thought they was down for that. You know what I mean? I remember thinking, shoot, this is, right? Until I was educated on what really happened to me. Because for a long time, I didn't know. I really didn't know. And so that's where we need to put our focus on. Forget the privilege in their big mouths. What about the underprivileged who have nowhere to go? And Cherie said it, they're suffering from substance abuse, mental illness, and no one, right? And they have nowhere to go. And one thing I want to say about too, even the substance abuse in the Black community in Boston, in the city of Boston, you know, we had detoxes that were in the city. Now, believe me, for me, any addict that's seeking recovery needs to get recovery, right? But what has even happened in our communities, in the Black community, like the detoxes in the Black community is dominated even by white clients. And there might be only one person of color in that whole treatment center. Why? Because the white addicts, whether they're young or what have you, have insurance, right? And not to mention, white people don't want detoxes and drug treatments in their neighborhoods, right? And so they have the ability to even take over the treatment facilities. So our people of color, our women of color who are trying to find beds, you know, to start even the process of getting clean in their own communities, they don't even have a bed there to go there first and then go to a house to address what has happened to them through prostitution. And that's where we need to put our focus and our money.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Audrey. Those are crucial points, all of them. And thanks everybody else. Thanks, girls. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure it's been very illuminating. And I hope personally that there's been plenty of people listening in who started out with the opposite position to us, or even undecided, because it's so important to give people a dose of reality on this issue. And I thank you all for having done that today.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Bye. And good
Thank
luck.
you.
Mama.
Bye, everybody.